Welcome to the Garrulous Gavel. I'm John Tico. My guests in this episode are Margaret Gandy and Rena Paul, two former New York City prosecutors who recently started a new law firm practicing what they call trauma-informed lawyering. We'll get garrulous with Margaret and Rena about how lawyers can learn new skills for dealing with clients and witnesses who have been the victims of violent crimes or other traumatic events. We'll also chat with our guests about the stresses and at times traumas of being a lawyer and how attorney well-being is important to leading an ethical and productive career as a lawyer. And then finally, we'll learn how our guests have been using expressive dance and adult coloring books to care for their own well-being while standing up a brand new law firm in the midst of a global pandemic. I really enjoyed meeting Margaret and Rena, and I think you will too. Welcome to the Garrulous Gavel podcast. My guests today are Margaret Gandy and Rena Paul, who are two lawyers who have recently formed a new law firm called Alka Law. And we're also trying something new here for us today, which is we are doing this remotely. Margaret and Rena are up in New York City, and I am coming to you from my office in Washington, D.C., and hopefully this will work and be a fun way to record. So welcome to the two of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As we usually do, we're going to start by kind of learning a little bit about our guests and talking to them about their backgrounds as lawyers and how they got to be where they are today. And then we're going to launch into our substantive topic today, which is going to be trauma-aware lawyering. We're going to learn what trauma-aware lawyering is and how Margaret and Rena have learned to apply that to their law practice, and maybe learn some interesting lessons for the rest of us who practice law, and also just hear an interesting story about how they came to this way of practicing law. And then at the end, as we usually do, we're going to spend a few minutes learning something fun about our guests. We'll be talking about the worlds of adult coloring and moving meditation. We're going to learn about both of these things, and maybe there's some intersection. Maybe you can move and color at the same time. I don't know. We'll figure it out. So let's start. We'll start with learning a little bit about the backgrounds of our guests. And Margaret, let me start with you. You went to college at Duke and then to law school at George Washington Law here in Washington, D.C. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. I was in DC for the first part of my career.
And what got you interested in going to law school?
Actually, in high school, I had the opportunity to do a course called Law and Justice. It was, an elective course that one of my teachers had, I think, wanted to be a lawyer and ended up in a high school classroom instead. And so he had this class where we studied true crime stories. We studied the criminal justice system. And because I grew up in Western New York, our field trip was to Attica, which is a notorious prison in New York, famous for an uprising many decades ago now. And so as a 16-year-old kid, I went to Attica on a school bus one day, and we sat with prisoners who told us about their lives, how they ended up there. One of them I remember to this day was named Heavy C, and he had a nice, big flat top, and he told us all about how he ended up in Attica because of a life on the streets. He lived in New York City. And it sounded very foreign to the, Western New York upbringing I had, but I was just fascinated. My mom likes to tell the story that I came home and said, I just sort of, felt at home there. And that didn't mean that I was bound for prison, but rather that bound for a career in criminal justice, at least for the first half of it. So that's what made me want to be a lawyer and want to be involved in criminal law specifically. It was a really formative experience for me.
So you're one of these people that kind of went into college knowing that that's where you were headed.
Yeah, I knew I wanted to be a lawyer. I knew I wanted it to be in criminal law, and the fact that it was going to be as a prosecutor, sort of evolved as I got into law school, and victim advocacy, frankly, is really what made me want to get into prosecution.
And then after law school, you kind of got right into that field, right? You went right from law school to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Is that right?
Yes, that was my first job out of law school. I was there at 25 years old and hit the ground running.
And so just for people who may not really kind of know all of these things about how the law world works, there's a number of different sort of prosecutors' offices in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
And those of us who operate in that world kind of know what the distinctions are, but maybe you could help explain that for us. What is the Manhattan District Attorney's Office?
It is the local prosecutor's office for New York County, which is Manhattan. New York City is made up of 5 boroughs, and every borough has its own district attorney's office. So the Manhattan DA's office covers crime committed in Manhattan, which is also known as New York County. And so it handles everything from, jumping a turnstile, or at least that used to be a prosecutable offense. You're jumping a turnstile all the way up through, the most egregious crimes like rape and murder, anything in between.
And just give me like a quick thumbnail sketch of the types of cases you worked on during the time you were at the Manhattan DA's office.
So I had a slightly non-traditional path through the office because on the first day I arrived as a, newly hired Manhattan ADA, I had come from advocacy work on behalf of domestic violence victims in law school. So I thought for sure that's the kind of work I would be doing. But I was surprised to find that I had been assigned to a related office known as the Office of the Special Narcotics Prosecutor. And that is an office that was created in New York City to handle drug and gun crimes throughout the entire city. So it has a different jurisdiction than the individual DA's offices. And a selection of ADAs from each of the 5 borough offices gets assigned there for a period of time. So in my early days, I was doing exclusively gun and drug cases, and but starting at the felony level. So it was sort of a right into the frying pan kind of experience at early in my career. So for the early times, I was doing that, street level drug cases. Then I went on to an investigative bureau known as the Special Investigations Bureau, where we did largely wiretap investigations with federal agencies, a lot of work with the DEA and also the NYPD. DEA is the Drug Enforcement Administration, for anyone who's not familiar. And then ultimately, so that was more the importation of drugs, cross-country shipments of 100+ kilos of cocaine, things of that sort, more operational organizations of crime. And then I moved to the Rackets Bureau in the DA's office. And there I did organized crime cases. I did fraud cases, bribery, government corruption cases. And I ultimately, my last case before I moved to the federal prosecutor's office was the first crime of terrorism prosecuted at the state level in Manhattan.
And what was that? What was the crime?
It was a conspiracy case, but it was a plot. I'm trying to remember how much of it is public. So it was a plot to attack houses of worship, and it involved the purchase of firearms, a collection of firearms in anticipation of a larger goal of obstruction and political statement through violence.
All right. So I know there's more to your career, but I want to give Rena a chance to jump in here and sort of catch up, because I know that you both sort of ended up in that office and maybe crossed paths for the first time while you were at the Manhattan DA's office. So Rena, you're a graduate of Emory, is that right? Undergrad?
Yes.
Down in Atlanta, and then you went to Brooklyn Law School, correct?
Yes.
Are you also a native New Yorker?
I am a native New York adjacent from the tri-state area, but not a New Yorker, though I feel like one at heart because I've been in New York for so long.
Okay, so that means you're from New Jersey.
I'm from Pennsylvania.
Oh, Pennsylvania. Oh,
yeah.
Okay. I'll ask the same question that I asked Margaret. How did you first get interested in pursuing a life in the law?
Yeah, so I ended up in Brooklyn Law School after Emory, but I truly never wanted to be a lawyer at all. I actually wanted to be a journalist in college. I was really always a writer and kind of drawn to storytelling and wanted to be a journalist. But I grew up in a household with an immigrant parent who told me from a young age that there were 2 careers that one could have. Those were doctors or lawyers, and I could choose between those 2 careers. And I was never very good at science, so lawyer felt like the better choice. And I ended up in Brooklyn Law School and really did not want to be studying law, but found myself drawn to the practice of criminal law because of the storytelling. And that's really driven my career, is my interest in people and what people are experiencing, kind of humanity, and how people interact with each other has always been my passion. And that really drew me into the DA's office after law school.
Yeah, I mean, for somebody who was not interested in law, you ended up on a sort of very sort of traditional lawyer path. So how did you end up at the Manhattan DA's office did you go there right out of law school?
I went right out of law school. I was very lucky to get that job. And I don't know if we have law students who listen to this podcast, but I teach at a law school. So I want to speak to law students as well about, that if you're applying to jobs and you're not getting jobs, maybe the best job that you are about to get is coming up, because that's what happened to me. I was not getting any jobs. I applied to just the Manhattan DA's office. That was the only job I really wanted. But I applied to many, many different ones because that's what you do when you're a law student. And luckily at the 11th hour, I got and landed that job. And it was really a dreamy place to start your career. It was a lot of young people all together. And, it was a lot of experience right away, as Maggie said, kind of into the frying pan, right, jumping out of law school classes into actual practice of law.
Yeah. I mean, I had a very different path. I sort of went clerkship, big law firm. And in both of those positions, you're somewhat insulated from, you're not as exposed, shall we say. There's always somebody above you. When you're clerking, there's a judge who's going to stop you from doing something stupid. And then when you go to the big law firm, there's layers of people above you. But from everything I've heard from folks who have gone directly into prosecutors' offices, you're often sort of just handed the file and say, go do the case almost right out of the bat. Was that your experience at the Manhattan DA's office?
The Manhattan DA's office had wonderful training. It had a really comprehensive training program at the beginning of your tenure there, but you can't really learn that job until you do that job, just like most jobs, right? So yes, they taught you about it and you sat through a number of trainings and tried to retain all the information as it came at you quickly and all at once. And then not until you actually are handed a file and have to make sense of what you're supposed to do. How do you investigate this? What crimes lie here? How do I prove them? What happens if I end up at trial? How do I do that? Those sorts of things really happened by learning by fire, doing it, learning by doing.
Do you remember kind of what your first case was?
I do remember what my first case was. My first case was a disorderly conduct case that was a woman standing on a street and waving her arms was the charge. It was a very unfortunate first trial. I did not win, as I should not have. But
because it's not against the law in New York to wave your arms. Is that what you're saying?
It was somebody blocking somebody else on the street. I think there was more going on there than met the eye, but nevertheless, I did not succeed in that case. But that was my first case.
All right, so give me the quick thumbnail sketch of kind of the course of your career at the Manhattan DA's office, and then when you get to the end of that, we'll talk a little bit about kind of where you and Margaret went from there.
Sure. So I had a different path than Maggie. I ended up in the appeals bureau as a first year at the DA's office, much to my chagrin, because if I was going to go do this lawyer thing, I wanted to try a case like they did on TV. But I ended up, probably because I wrote a lot, in college, and I wrote in law school, I ended up in the writing position of the appellate bureau. It was very, very crestfallen, but it was really the best thing that happened to my career, because it really gave me a foundation to read other people's trials and what they did right, what they did wrong, where mistakes got made, and it gave me this foundation to understand before I walked into the courtroom what was going on. So I was there for 2 years, and then I transferred to a traditional trial bureau where I worked on the gamut of violent cases and kind of street crime cases. I was in the sex crimes unit. I worked on domestic violence cases, some cases involving children, and a lot of violence. So robberies, street crimes, things where someone is harming somebody else was really mostly what my focus was. Some white collar stuff, but more street crime.
Okay. So, I'll kind of open this up to either one of you, but what is kind of the story of how the two of you crossed paths? I take it the Manhattan DA's office is a very large office, so it's not a place where everybody knows everybody else, right?
True.
That's right.
Yeah. So but at some point, did the two of you get to know each other at that office?
A little bit.
We need to give credit to someone who was both of a mentor and a person who has brought us together. His name is Dan Alonzo, if he's listening to this podcast, or we'll send it to him. And we have to credit him because he was really the one who introduced us and said, "You're both going to the U.S. Attorney's office. You both need to meet." That was where we really solidified our relationship out of the DA's office.
Okay, so to just kind of move the story forward, so we're talking now. The year is 2013, I believe. You've both been at the Manhattan DA's office for about 7 or 8 years. I think you both started at around the same time, maybe a year apart, right? Mm-hmm. And then in 2013, you both made the jump from the Manhattan DA's office to one of the other prosecutors' offices in New York, which was the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York. So that's a mouthful. So, Margaret, maybe you could take the ball back and just explain to the people that are listening here, what is the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York, and how is it different from the Manhattan DA's office?
Sure. So the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District is the federal prosecutor's office for the Eastern District of New York, which covers Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and Long Island. So, I often would say it's the same job, more or less, just with a completely different set of rules. So one thing that, for crimes to be federal crimes, they obviously have to be in the United States Code. There have to be some sort of federal nexus that makes the crime prosecutable by the federal government rather than the local government. So it's not just going to be a murder that happens in that. It's going to have to be a murder that's tied to organized crime. It's going to have to be a fraud that has an interstate impact. So the nature of the crimes are, there's overlap, but there's, additional criteria that has to be met in order for it to be prosecuted by the federal government. In practice, since this is probably mostly attorneys listening, the biggest difference I think Rena and I both saw was that in the DA's office, a lot of stuff is done orally. You do motions, but they're relatively pro forma. Most of the work gets done before a judge orally arguing your point, and a decision is made on the spot. Federal practice is a whole nother ballgame. Everything is in writing. Everything is written in advance. Every oral argument is scripted. And the judge is the ultimate, arbiter of everything, of what the sentence should be, of what happens in a trial, what happens in the pretrial litigation. Whereas in state court, as a prosecutor, you have a lot more power, frankly, because you negotiate your own sentences. And there's a lot more predictability in how a case will be resolved. So it was much the same. I mean, we certainly had a wonderful foundation to work from, having been state prosecutors for so many years, but we both had a huge learning curve. And I know because we've talked about it, we're both grateful for it, for sure.
So you both went in there as assistant U.S. attorneys, which is sort of the standard position in the office if you're a lawyer. Were you doing similar types of work?
Yes, we were doing similar.
Yeah, everybody that comes into that office starts in the general crimes section, and you do, sort of the entry level work for a while. And then we both progressed coincidentally, but to our pleasure, to the organized crime and gangs unit, where we both spent the rest of our time in the office. And
I'm going to jump to the end of the story, but then backtrack a little bit. So the end of the story is that, at least the end of that part of the story, is that in, I think, the sort of late 2019, early 2020, both of you left at around the same time. Is that right?
So I left before Maggie left. I left in 2019. Maggie did not leave until 2020, squarely during the pandemic. I left and went to work with a global investigations firm, and from there went to work as an attorney with a law firm, but really anticipating opening a practice. So I was trying to get the experience of the private sector, both as an investigator and as a lawyer.
And when did the two of you start to think about forming a firm together?
So I think, Maggie and I have spent a lot of time during our careers having closed door conversations about a lot of different things and about the law, the practice of law, what we wanted to do as we had the privilege of the experience that we've had, and what we wanted to do to be of service in this world after leaving the prosecutor's office. And, we both really started this work really young. And, as you said, some our friends were clerks and at law firms who were taking a different path. We started at a place where we were interfacing with people in trauma all the time. And our early formative experiences as lawyers were always about that, which was really different from our colleagues who were working in kind of a more, I don't know what one is traditional or more traditional, but more of a law firm path. And so one of the things that Maggie and I talked about was really the interest in humanity, the fascination with the way that people treated each other, and the awesome responsibility that we had as young as we were, and still as young as we were when we were at the U.S. Attorney's Office, to be making these decisions that impacted the lives of real people in real situations. And we would talk about that a lot, and what we could do in that job and beyond to kind of do it the best way that we could do it. So, we talked a lot about respect and wanting to do the job with respect, with a kind of a reverence for everybody that came into our path and a respect for what they were going through, whether or not they were somebody who was accused of the worst thing, or somebody that we were interfacing with who'd been a survivor of a crime. And so that was really, I would say, the genesis of this firm. And while it has evolved over time and ultimately has ended up where it is, the idea that we would share and do something together that would, in the hopes of making the world a better place, as hokey as that might sound, really has been going on for many years between us.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. I mean, that raises a bunch of interesting questions that I'm sure people often wonder about kind of what it is like to be a prosecutor. And, as I'm sure you're already discovering now that you're in private practice, when you're in private practice, you often feel like you're kind of sort of dealing with the people in power, but you're not the person that is actually in power. And the sense when you're on the private practice side is that the people that have the true power are often the government. And in criminal cases, that's the prosecutors. And, have you sort of like sensed that shift too, that you were sort of inside the source of power and now you're outside the source of power?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, in the work we've done, we haven't had, pitches to the Department of Justice, like on the heels of an internal investigation, like mitigation presentations and stuff. That's not really the focus of our work, or it hasn't been so far. I'm sure we would feel it acutely then. We have had some crossover with colleagues on the federal, prosecutor side, and so yeah. I mean, I think we are aware of our new role. I mean, we frankly are fortunate and privileged that we have that experience and that we know people still in those positions, because it does give you a behind the curtains look at how that operation works, how those decisions are made. And we've already had the occasion, even in the short term of our private practice existing, of being able to leverage that sort of behind the curtains awareness to the benefit of our clients, because prosecutors are incredibly powerful, and in our experience, motivated by the right things. But at the end of the day, sometimes the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So yeah, I think we are aware of who holds the power, but also using our insight to, work within the system that we know exists.
And so let's start to kind of transition into the substance that we wanted to talk about, which is what you call trauma aware lawyering. So maybe one of you can just kind of tell me what you mean when you talk about trauma aware lawyering.
Yes. So to talk about trauma aware lawyering, we first should be defining trauma, which can have a number of definitions, but the one that we point to is one that the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration gives. And that is that individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So basically, trauma can be from one incident, right? It can be from a prolonged series of incidents, like over childhood, like a domestic violence situation, for example. And as attorneys, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and those in the private sector who are interfacing with not only the obvious traumas like sexual misconduct, but also really even in business related cases and any kind of white collar work, it finds its way in, because everyone that a lawyer deals with is most likely dealing with a trauma, right? Because they're coming to you. Very rarely do we get anybody coming to us who is really having the best day. They're usually having the worst day. So they're showing up with a problem that needs to be solved, and they are experiencing their own emotions and their own, emotional, physical, social, spiritual well-being around that problem. And so learning how to be somebody who interfaces with that kind of trauma is really at the core of what trauma-informed approach is. Understanding that it's there, being aware of how it impacts the work that you're doing, awareness of your own response to it, and taking it into account as you're doing your work.
And when did you start kind of thinking about those topics, from a career perspective?
So I don't know that trauma aware practices is a term that either of us knew, 15 plus years ago when we started our legal careers, but I think we both were practicing it from the jump, just with no vocabulary for it. So my first real substantive experience in the law was in my third year of law school. I did a fellowship at an organization in Washington, D.C. that no longer exists, sadly, I've learned, but it was called WEAVE, Women Empowered Against Violence. And it was an organization, I was there as a law clerk doing this fellowship through my university, but providing direct legal services to domestic violence victims who were seeking orders of protection, seeking divorce, seeking child custody, family law matters to extricate themselves from these situations. And what was really cool about that organization is that they had a holistic approach to services, because they recognized that when somebody is in a traumatic situation, it's not just going to be, how do I get divorced or how do I get an order of protection? It's going to be, now I need housing. Now I need employment. I've had an unstable lifestyle. How can I get my kids and the social services they need? And so it really addressed all of those, the ripple effects of a traumatic or exploitive situation. So, my first experience was sitting in a room with a woman whose, life is in absolute chaos, and trying to get connection with her so she'll tell me her story so we can get her the services she needs. I certainly didn't call it trauma informed. I probably wasn't particularly artful at it at the time, but I think I learned very quickly that if you are not there with authenticity, with empathy, and with just good open listening skills, you are not going to be of service to your client.
Right. I mean, so there's no question that lawyers deal with clients who are often at a crisis moment in their life, which is why they're dealing with the legal system, right? Most people don't seek out the legal system for fun. It's usually because something has happened that is requiring them to reach out to a lawyer. So lawyers have always dealt with clients in crisis, have always dealt with people that are in difficult positions. What is it about the sort of way that you've learned to think and talk about it that you think is, maybe new or different?
Our approach is really critical on the private side in an internal investigation and in client relationships. Whether that investigation is about something very sensitive, like a sexual misconduct situation, or something like a business dispute, it is relevant in any kind of those investigations. And as you're saying, when you sit down with an attorney in an investigation and you are a witness, the attorney is really wanting to open two doors, right? The first door is nobody wants to talk to a lawyer, period, usually, in my experience. So the first door you're trying to open is just talk to me, period. The second is nobody really wants to talk to a lawyer about something really difficult personally that's happened to them, sensitive, particularly if it involves a sex crime, but really anything that touches on something that's embarrassing or difficult in their lives, not just, here's the documents and let me explain to you what the documents say. Anything kind of beyond that is the second door that you're trying to open. So most lawyers get to sit down in an interview like that, and they get to open the first door because maybe the witness is working for the company that you're retained by, and so they have to sit down with you. And you kind of have this access to talk about, all right, what happened? What do these documents say? Trying to get to the truth of what happened. And we sit down and we go through those motions. But the second part, which is beyond the next step, what is actually the person going through? What are the things that you can unlock in that conversation that could give you more information as an attorney and help you do better for your client? That's really the second piece that we think, given the experience that we have and what we have gone through as both state prosecutors, federal prosecutors, being in rooms with all types of different kind of scenarios where people are dealing with all kinds of things, from the very small to the very, very serious, has given us an insight into speaking with people in very difficult situations. And so it's really about building trust. And how do you build trust as a lawyer? Usually not by wearing a suit and showing up with your briefcase and putting stacking your papers around you and trying to have a conversation that way. It's usually and maybe it's not usual, that what we are saying is it's by radical openness, right? So the difference is, instead of doing that, coming in with a suit on, your briefcase, and sitting down at the table with your papers about you and saying, I'm a lawyer and you're going to tell me what happened, we approach the process with a much different vibe, a much more radical openness. I'm here to talk to you, and I am open-minded, and I am not judgmental. I don't have any judgment about what this conversation that we're going to have today, and I truly don't. You bring yourself into that mind space where even if this is someone who's done something very wrong, you're not judging them. Really accepting where they are and what is going on with them. Trying to be as transparent as possible. So as a lawyer, there's a lot of gamesmanship and a lot of caginess, and we know all the different kind of wordsmithing that lawyers love to use, and advocacy language and poker faces, but really trying to be as transparent as possible in the scenarios. And then when you can't be transparent, saying that you're not going to be transparent, and operating from a place of curiosity. So coming to this with a spirit of interest and curiosity that is different than, coming to it from a perspective of, I'm going to solve this problem by reading the book, checking the boxes, and then solving the problem.
Yeah. So I think that's very interesting. And what really kind of got me interested in what you're doing is that you seem to have really given a lot of thought to kind of systematizing these sort of human interactions that lawyers do all the time anyhow, right? I mean, when you're in law school, you learn about legal rules and legal research and strategy and how to deal with judges. But I don't recall there being a moment in law school where at least not in any systematic way, we were taught or even really asked to think very deeply about sort of these human interactions that we might have with clients or witnesses, or even opposing counsel or other lawyers, right? That was, I guess, at least implicitly seen as sort of like outside of the kind of stuff you had to think about in a systematic way. Like, and then when you get into lawyering, you quickly realize that there is a real human element to it. And I think I probably always just assumed, well, some people are good at that and other people are not. Some people are just good at being people. They're just good at dealing with other people. They're empathetic. They're nice people. They're good listeners. Other people, not so much. We've all dealt with lawyers who are very much at the opposite end of the spectrum, who are just kind of like, bulls in a china shop, we normally say, right? They don't really pay any attention to anybody around them. But this idea of like sitting back and thinking about those interactions in a systematic way, it seems that's what you've really done. And if I'm interpreting some of the materials you gave me correctly, it looks like you developed, or one of you developed, some training materials that you actually use to help other prosecutors think about these issues. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So it's true. We've spent a lot of time thinking about these interactions, and you're right. Some of it is innate. Trial work, lawyering is an art and not a science. And you learn the science in law school. You learn how to research on Westlaw. You learn how to write a brief. But the art of it comes when you watch an amazing trial lawyer try a case, right? And that person has that little extra something that they can stand in front of a jury and captivate that jury. And some of that is innate, but some of it is learned and by training and experience. Maybe not everybody can become to the level of the person who has the innate ability to try that case, but the experience and training can certainly elevate your practice. And that is what we want to train people to do. And that is the way we're approaching our practice.
So Rena, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you developed the trauma-aware training that you did while you were still working as a prosecutor.
Yeah. So, after I left the office, I really wanted to make sure that I was continuing to, in some way, support and give back to the places that I was working. And I joined the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution, which is a prosecutorial think tank in Manhattan that really looks at innovative ways to do the work. I started consulting with them, and during COVID, we started working on, actually, I should say right before COVID, we started working on trauma-informed prosecution and developing a curriculum around trauma-informed prosecution. From there, the natural next step was really about prosecutor well-being. And we developed a training and curriculum during COVID about prosecutor well-being. So that was really where we began to systematize kind of the language and the vocabulary around what Maggie had said we've been doing our whole careers. And so studying it, learning that, it's actually funny. I read this book called Trauma Stewardship by Laura Vandernoot Lipsky. And as I read that book, I thought, oh my gosh, this is what I've been doing the whole time. Somebody gave language to this. Oh, I've been looking for this language. So, it's not something we invented, but it's something that we studied and took our experience and started to think critically about how we experienced it and what we could do to systematize it to help other attorneys and prosecutors learn how to do it better.
And those materials that you put together, they're out there for the public to look at, right?
Yeah, so you can find the materials on prosecution.org, which is the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution's website. We do trainings. You can look at our website, which is alcalaw.com. We have been doing and are doing trainings across the country for prosecutors, and we are offering trainings for lawyers, law firms, investigators at law firms who wish to seek this kind of training as well.
And we'll put some links in the show notes to those materials. There's a fairly extensive slideshow on trauma-informed prosecution that really kind of, I thought, I read through it and thought it was a really good piece there that really explains sort of your thinking around these issues. And would be, something I think somebody who's interested in this should probably read through that slideshow, because I think it gives a good summary of kind of your thinking. But have you had a chance to actually do that training for prosecutors' offices?
Yeah, so I have done it for prosecutors' offices across the country. It's been really great. And before COVID, when we were developing it, we spent a lot of time thinking about how we were going to convince people that they needed to learn this material, and how we were going to convince people that they needed to also be taking care of their own well-being, because really at the core of the connection between those two is the idea that in order to do what me and Maggie have been speaking about for the last however long we've been on the podcast, about being really somebody that can show up in a room with somebody, connect to them, be empathetic, non-judgmental, and have a conversation with somebody from a place of openness and curiosity, that is cultivating self-awareness and mindfulness are two things that you need as a prosecutor, as a lawyer, to be cultivating in order to be better at that skill. And that those self-awareness and mindfulness are things that there are many practices, and we could spend the next 10 podcasts talking about how many different kinds of modalities there are to try to get at learning more about yourself and being more mindful. It doesn't really matter which one you're interested in. Any of them as a lawyer is something to look into, because it can help you develop an understanding of how people observe you when you're interacting with somebody as a witness or a client, and also to create some space in your brain so when you are being approached, or when you are interfacing with somebody who's in trauma, that you can take the space for yourself to understand how to respond appropriately.
And what is the difference in the way you're using those terms between self-awareness and mindfulness?
So self-awareness or self-study really means looking at how you are understanding yourself, what you're bringing to the table. We're working in a landscape as prosecutors and as lawyers where bias, your natural biases are something that can affect your work. So beginning there, right? Understanding what you're bringing into it, your history, what you're showing up with as kind of a perception. And when you come into a room, how do people respond to you? And how can you modulate the way that you are behaving to get the result that you want, right? To be more connected to somebody. If somebody is really heightened, to understand that you can come in and be more relaxed in a way to make them feel more comfortable. If someone's incredibly shut down, you can come into the room and find ways to connect with them from that place. So that means learning to understand who you are first in that dynamic. And mindfulness, meaning being more present in the present moment, being able to take a step back from, we're sitting here talking to each other. You get very mired, especially on a screen, into the moment that you're in, but being able to kind of take some more spaciousness into that moment so that when you're interacting as an attorney, you can use that same tool to take some space and time when you're having a conversation so that you can be more supportive of the person that you're speaking to. You can be able to read the situation and get the information that you're looking for in a more cohesive way.
And so, maybe it would help to kind of talk about a real kind of real world nuts and bolts problem that prosecutors, or really any lawyers, face. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how this approach might be different from how lawyers typically do it, or what we could learn from this kind of approach. So, a common occurrence, I assume, in the criminal justice world is you are talking to somebody who has been, say, the victim of a crime. You're trying to learn something from that person about what occurred. And you need to, you're sort of, the thing you're trying to do as a lawyer normally is sort of extract information from them to see whether you have a case, all right? Or what that person can add to your case. So, maybe one of you could kind of talk about how this sort of trauma-informed approach might be different from how you think lawyers maybe more typically would approach that kind of interaction with a victim of a crime.
Yeah, that's actually a great way to illustrate the value that having a trauma aware approach, can have value because where you enter the room as a lawyer with an agenda, I need to, as a prosecutor, I need to establish X, Y, and Z elements of this crime in order to decide that I can charge it. Or as a, maybe an employment investigation, I need to establish X, Y, and Z in order to know whether or not this is a fireable offense or it violates the policy, whatever. And so I think, attorneys often are very linear thinkers. You know, I need the answers to these five critical questions, and I will come in, and my agenda in this meeting is to get you to answer these five critical questions. And I think a lot of attorneys, if you don't have that moment of self reflection and sort of, a trauma aware approach to it, you can go in sort of like, all business and go A to B to C to D, E. You might get your answers, you might, but um, in our experience, taking a different approach to that same scenario gives you a more fulsome account of the person's experience. And on a even broader level, it is a better way to achieve a fair outcome because you need people to believe that the process by which you get to the end result is fair and is one of integrity. And so making sure that the process by which you get to your answers does no further harm to someone who's already in this compromised state is a value that we both subscribe to and that we put in practice. So the way you would approach that in a trauma informed way is that maybe your first thing you do is to set expectations. I've scheduled this meeting to last 1 hour so you can sort of emotionally pace yourself. If you need to take a break, you'll let me know. If I ask you a question you aren't comfortable answering during this first meeting, I can respect that boundary. You'll let me know, and we'll come back to that some other time. Setting those sort of expectations so this person now feels some element of power or control or predictability is a really important aspect of dealing with someone who's in trauma that you're trying to elicit information from. And I think the other part of it is trauma victims are not linear thinkers typically. They don't necessarily remember which sequence of events happened or what sequence the events happened in. And as prosecutors and as attorneys investigating a matter, we often want it to be start at the beginning and then move forward to the end. A classic direct examination. What happened next? And then what happened? And you have to be willing to acknowledge, or there's a great value in acknowledging that that's not how traumatized people order their memories. There might be one really vivid memory, and then the details about when so and so said what, or if that's before you called the cops or after, that might be very blurry. And if you're not mindful of the impact that trauma has on people as you're interviewing them, you might think that is a sign of lack of credibility and we don't. You have to look at all of these circumstances, of course, but the fact that somebody's memories about a traumatic event are not linear is not necessarily tied to the credibility of the memory. And so it's much better to come in and say, why don't you start where you're comfortable starting, and then letting the conversation flow from there.
And the real difference in what Maggie is describing really comes back to the kind of core principles of curiosity. And if you're coming in with an agenda looking for the answers to A, B, and C, you lose a bit of curiosity. You lose a bit of creativity. And there you lose a bit of opportunity. Because if you are able to come with an open mind to understand that you're sitting down with someone who doesn't need to give you A, B, C, or D, but actually E, F, and G might be incredibly critical, and you didn't make the space to be curious and connect with that person in a way that made them feel safe enough to speak to you or motivated to speak to you, you're going to miss those E, F, and G, and you're still going to probably get the answers that you're okay. You're going to say that it happened on this date X, it was in this location, and it was this, these elements or these parts of the civil action that we're looking for. But you're going to miss the finesse of what connection can do. When you show up and you're in an authentic place, you get back authenticity, and that really can enhance your practice and your learning.
So how do you know the difference? Let's focus on this hypothetical. You're conducting your first meeting with somebody who has been the victim of some sort of traumatic crime, let's say an assault. And you're having a difficult time kind of getting the story out of them, right? Because at the end of the day, you do need some sort of chronology of events, right, in order to write your indictment or whatever it is you're going to do. You're trying to sort of get the chronological story out of them, and you're having a hard time doing that because they're not thinking about things in that linear fashion. They're more interested in talking about, their experiences or whatever. I mean, how do you, at the end of the day, you still need to get to the chronology of events, right? And so how do you distinguish between somebody who is whose thinking is the function of their dealing with the trauma versus somebody who just doesn't have a good chronology to give you, right? I mean, because sometimes people just don't remember, or maybe things didn't happen exactly the way they think, or maybe they are dissembling. So how do you distinguish between sort of somebody who's dealing with trauma versus somebody who's just doesn't have the facts to give you?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking about the critical question of credibility and assessing credibility in a trauma-informed way. And that's the $1 million question. And that there is, when you go to be a juror in a jury, they tell you there's no magic formula to measure credibility. You use your own life experience. And having the experience of interviewing hundreds of people who have had such an experience or myriad experiences of all kinds of trauma, you start to learn patterns and ways that people respond, even though everybody responds completely differently, that allow you to make credibility assessments. At its most this is a lecture, this is a law school class, not a podcast answer.
Well, maybe just give me like an example, like from your own experiences. I mean, I assume between the two of you, you've probably done hundreds of interviews just like this. I mean, have you had personal experiences where, you went in and interviewed somebody and you just could not get a clear story out of them, but you sort of later concluded that in fact that was not because they didn't have a clear story to give you, but it's just because they were dealing with the trauma of the event that they were trying to describe, and maybe just kind of walk us through like an actual real world example of where this kind of thinking was helpful.
Yeah, so I think, I think this is the bread and butter of any prosecutor who's done violent crime work. I mean, if it's not the victim themselves, it's an eyewitness who has a critical piece who says, it's not worth the exposure to me for me to give you this critical piece. So, I mean, it's going to be, this is the inability to answer this precisely is exactly the heart of trauma-informed work, right? Because it is absolutely contingent on who is the person sitting across from me in this moment, and what am I getting from them that I can use to extract information from them by showing empathy, by pushing in this direction, by letting up in that direction. Sometimes it's a matter of one thing that often would come up as prosecutors is, if you think somebody is motivated to lie, they usually give that away at some point. And sometimes it's by asking them an innocuous question that you don't really expect them to remember. And if they're filling in every one of those with a detail that sort of bolsters their position and makes the other party look bad in some way or another, you start to think, I think I'm getting convenient answers rather than a truthful accounting of the history. So you certainly learn little tricks of the trade of ways of sort of testing, and you come to understand that not remembering certain details is normal, but maybe you could say, well, what was the weather like? And you can kind of get a time of year from that. Or, it's the holidays and you always travel around Christmas, were you home? There's little tricks you can do like that to try to elicit it. I mean, I think that's probably true of many lawyers' practice. But as far as, exactly what you do, I think patience is absolutely critical, not insisting that you get that information out of them in this one meeting. And then also understanding what matters to them and using that to motivate them, if they have children, if they're looking for safety planning right now, that's a great example right there. If a person comes in and you're trying to get information from grand jury and you know that they have nowhere to go to bed that night, you need to shift the gears to safety planning. Conversation number one is safety planning. Let's get you set up for a safe place to go tonight before we try to get you to tell us a story of what happened last week. And so it's just reading the room and reading this person's needs and trying to meet those needs in the limited ways you can, given the nature of your interaction, before you get to your own needs.
Yeah, and you're asking about how do I go in and make sure that the thing that I'm seeing is the right thing and not something else, right? And it's the classic example of somebody that you sit down with, and of course we've had lots of experiences with people dealing with things different ways. As human beings, we all have, right? You've seen people who cry at a funeral, and you see people who laugh at a funeral. And does that mean that the person who's laughing at the funeral isn't sad, or they didn't experience the loss? The human emotions come up in different ways. And so there's no precise answer to how do you tell me, in a soundbite how to do it. The answer is hire people who are experienced and understand, have the ability to, and the experience to have had that experience of sitting down with so many different people. And if you're somebody that wants to learn it and are listening to this and you're thinking, this is the kind of work I want to do and I want to learn how to do it, finding ways to sit down with as many people as possible is the first step. And that's what I always tell law students that in my class is, you have your world, you got your world and your people that are in your world, and you talk to them and they tell you what they think, and then you don't kind of expand outside of that. So if you want to see how something is landing, try to talk to people that you don't usually talk to and get a diverse experience speaking to people and sharing your position, or even interviewing them about something or talking to them, because that's how you learn how to talk to people, is by talking to a lot of people, and the way that people usually respond to you when you are asking them questions.
In your experience in the prosecutor's offices, do you think that most prosecutors do this naturally over time, or do you think it's the opposite? In other words, did you see that there were a lot of prosecutors who really were not good at these kinds of interactions with witnesses or victims? And if so, why were they not good?
We definitely, I don't know if I'd say most. I think it is something that evolves. It's a skill set that evolves over time. Absolutely. I think Rena and I both would say, by year 13, 14, 15, we were adept at this in a way that we weren't in years 1, 2, and 3, for sure, because you learn what works and what doesn't. But I think we certainly knew prosecutors who could not take off their, sort of central casting vision of what a prosecutor should be. The buttoned up look, the authoritative voice, the leveraging of power. They couldn't come out from under that, whether that was a form of, just comfort or security or a lack of confidence in the humanity side of it. And I think we shared the belief that those people were less effective as prosecutors because of it.
Do you think now that somebody like that can learn to be better? In other words, are we talking here about just sort of, I guess what people would often say are just kind of soft personality skills, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some people are empathetic, some people are less empathetic. Psychologists test these things and have scales for them, right? So if you're just on the less empathetic end of the scale, how, can you get better at these things? And how would you help somebody like that get better?
Everybody can get better at anything they put their mind to, is my belief. And the first step is to recognize yourself, right? And that goes back to self-awareness as the fundamental part of it. And so if you are able, how would you help someone? I mean, this is kind of at the core of the training, is to start to understand how to look at yourself. And to do that, you need to be doing things that are looking at how you arrived at the job that you're doing. And as prosecutors, you want to look at, what things led me here? and how do I find myself? What's my history? What things are important to me? And how did I find myself here? And that is the first, taking a look at yourself, is kind of step one. And then taking a look at how other people perceive you is step two. So yes, anybody who is, I don't know that there's, somebody who's more naturally has those soft skills versus somebody who leans more heavily into kind of the legalese and loves, the law and loves to kind of wrestle with a statute maybe and doesn't really enjoy talking to people. Anybody can learn how to be better by, in the same way that you would learn writing, right? Or in the same way that you would learn trial work, by studying it. And that's what we're trying to do, is to really study and dissect and deconstruct the way that it's done in order to be able to help others learn it.
So maybe talk a little bit about something that I think you started to hint at, Rena, which is that there's a connection between what you're calling trauma-informed lawyering and lawyer well-being. Certainly people within the legal profession, I think it's pretty well known that incidences of depression, anxiety, alcoholism, that those are high in the legal profession. I think that's usually attributed to the fact that it's can be a stressful job to have. You are dealing with other people's problems and helping other people solve their problems, sometimes very difficult problems. You're dealing with conflict. You have to fight with the other lawyers, fight with the judges. There's just a lot of things about the legal profession that I think put lawyers themselves under certain types of stressors that can lead to these higher incidences of psychological problems. What do you see as the connection between trauma-informed lawyering and then the psychological experience of being the lawyer who is dealing with those types of issues?
So, the American Bar Association has begun to pay attention to this topic, and it's evolving as, it has been evolving since really 2015, 2016. And it's now more than ever a topic that everybody is paying attention to, because after we all experienced this collective trauma of the last 18 months, and continue to experience it as we're all continuing to try to sort through this pandemic, I think it became very clear that everybody needs some support, and lawyers in particular. So when you're dealing with trauma, you are experiencing that trauma. You are vicariously experiencing that trauma. And that means, when you are day in and day out taking in the problems of somebody else, it has an impact on you. And it is very important as the person in that seat. In fact, I would say that it is ethically important, beyond just important for your own well-being. It is important as for ethics reasons, as an attorney, to be taking care of yourself. And so the way that it has been done over the last, before kind of this new wave of well-being in the law was being looked at, was in a reactive way. People were responding with lawyers' assistance programs that were attending to problems that had already arisen. Somebody is already dealing with a substance abuse issue or an extreme mental health issue. And those programs are wonderful because they help people that are in those sort of really extreme situations. But what the training that I have been doing with prosecutors across the country, and the training that we are offering to law firms, is really about how to take a more proactive approach. And instead of reacting to the problem, now that we all see it, understanding that devoting resources to that problem is going to not only keep your staff there in the work and not leaving, because we've seen a lot of jumps from firms as the pandemic has happened, and as people are dealing with many more things than they used to be in managing workflow. So not only keeping your staff there, but keeping your staff well is going to permit them to do their jobs better. And really, we are seeing firms invest the resources in it more and more. And, we are offering firms who wish to invest the resources in it, consulting and training, ways to do that in a way that can really support their staff members. And the connection to trauma, being trauma informed, is really back to self-awareness and mindfulness. The connection is being the type of person that can do this sort of work. And back to your earlier question about how do people learn, unlocking this empathy starts with taking care of your own self. And so being able to sit with somebody means being able to sit with yourself first and taking care of yourself so you can take care of others. Like, I flew for the first time recently. I remember flying. I don't know if you guys have flown, but you're putting on your mask before you put on the mask of somebody else. So that's really at the core of the prosecutor and attorney well-being push.
And so tell me a little bit about the type of training that you offer to other law firms. Is this just sort of PowerPoint, we'll kind of teach you things that way, or is it more hands-on? I imagine some of these things some of the types of things you're talking about are probably hard to absorb through a PowerPoint and are sort of better absorbed through some kind of experiential learning. But we're still in the middle of the COVID pandemic. I'm not sure how comfortable people are with kind of more experiential learning yet. But how do you do this training?
So we've been really lucky to actually get a lot of opportunity in prosecutors' offices to test this, because prosecutors' offices are feeling incredibly strapped at this time and are looking for ways to support their staff. And the level of training, either experiential or PowerPoint, is as creative as we will be permitted to be inside of the organization that we're invited into. So we've done trainings that are just an hour of a lecture on CLE, like we are all accustomed to collecting our CLE credits, and something maybe a little outside the box for that is fun. But really, other offices have engaged us to do a more substantive and holistic look, and we're partnering with people who do different modalities of healing work and wellness work. So movement, which we can talk about in a moment, and breath work and yoga and things that maybe, a skeptical person might kind of say, I don't have time to do that. I don't have time to meditate. I don't have time to do yoga. I don't have time. I've never heard of this type of modality. The idea is to make it really accessible, understanding that lawyers are busy. We are all so busy, and we are all so in need of it, that there's finding solutions depending on the organization that you're working with to give the employees really bite-sized ways to enter into proactive care for themselves.
What are your kind of like background sources for this? I sort of hear you implicitly bringing in ideas from maybe psychology, from meditation, maybe from, various other kinds of practices that people have developed over the years to try to develop what you call mindfulness and so forth. Like, what do you see as kind of the basic source or sources that you see as the most important for what you're trying to teach?
So we partnered with a woman named Allison Trank, who's a wonderful licensed clinical social worker and someone who's mired kind of in the brain side of it, and has taught me so much about the way that people's brains operate and neuroplasticity and the idea of how the things that I was experiencing as a prosecutor, I'm having all these kind of aha moments that, these things are, when I'm speaking to her about my experience, I learned from her so many things about the brain and the body that she has studied and learned. And so it's based on that and the experience in sort of traditional psychology. I'm a certified yoga teacher, so it's experiential in my own, frankly, my own desire to help myself be a better prosecutor and do better at that job, because understanding how burnout was affecting me when I was in that role and getting to the point where I knew I needed to help myself, and experimenting with all kinds of different modalities and seeing what worked for me, what didn't work for me, but really being really open-minded and curious about what could work and help, and then integrating into my own personal practice things that happen for 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute throughout the day that can make things easier when you're grinding in a job that's as difficult as being a lawyer.
Yeah. And one of the key takeaways that I took from reading through your training materials was sort of less about the specific thing that the individual lawyer is going to do to try to deal with their own issues, but more about building in sort of awareness within the organization that lawyer well-being should just be something that we pay attention to in a systematic way, in whatever way that organization is going to choose, right? I mean, a lot of legal organizations are very large, very hierarchical, very top-down. I'm sure prosecutors' offices must be that way. There's a lot of policy decisions that have to be made by people at the top and then handed down through the ranks. Big law firms are certainly often very hierarchical and often have, as the primary focus, the business and the cases, not as much focus, I would say, historically on kind of the well-being of the individuals within that organization. So just sort of finding ways to kind of build sort of organizational awareness around these issues. Is that sort of a part of what you're trying to do?
Yeah, there's no way to support the employees of an organization without the leadership's buy-in. And leadership of a law firm is different than a prosecutor's office, is different from a defense attorney's office. And so being nimble enough to work with everybody and listening to what people need and working around what their constraints are, what their resources are, what their staff is like, what does their day look like? Are they back in office? Are they not in office? And just customizing the work to really whoever you're working with. That's the most important piece. But the other piece is to give individuals the tools to do it themselves and to have the organization support those individuals in doing that. So introducing people to ways that they can take that into their own lives and support themselves during their workday. And then the organization saying, we give you permission to do that. And everybody kind of helping each other to make themselves, more available to the work. And it is good for the employee, and it's also good for the organization.
And what are some things, I kind of think about this from like a private practice perspective, right? Because we have a law firm, about 20 lawyers, which is now sort of approaching, I guess, sort of a mid-sized firm almost. And as we've gotten bigger, we certainly find that, we spend more and more of our time dealing with like HR type issues. And certainly during the pandemic, the transition to online work, different people in the firm have reacted in very different ways. For some people, it was a good experience. For other people, I think, very difficult experience. And so like, what kind of advice would you give somebody in my position? Just some very sort of simple, practical things we could do. Is it just like give people more vacation time? Is it, like what are some sort of like structural things that a law firm could do to sort of create more space for the employees to kind of take care of their own well-being?
So one thing you can do without spending any money to bring anybody else in is to create community. And we all really need community during this time. We need each other. We need our families. We need our loved ones. We need our friends, and we need our coworkers to be supportive. And we need our bosses to also too. And so as someone who's in a management position, finding ways to create that community would be my.
Like what? Give me some concrete examples. I mean, that sounds very great. I want community. Who doesn't want community? But tell me what to do. What do I do?
That would be a longer conversation for who's in your office and what you guys do. How do you speak to each other? How many, how are you interacting day in and day out? If you just, are you all siloed, not speaking to each other? Are you able to create some sort of organizational cohesion that is helping people? People are living all kinds of different ways. Some people are living alone and have nobody. And some people are living with families and really overwhelmed by childcare. And so, I don't know who's working in your office, but just to be able to sort of take everybody where they are and then find ways to connect.
I think you can find ways to like set some community boundaries. Like, so for example, one of my earliest bosses in the DA's office at 5:30 every Friday night, he would do a lap and he would say, "Get out of here." And if you said, "No, I'm in the middle, I've got to finish," he would say, "Tell me what you have to finish." And he would sort of adjudicate whether it was worth staying late to do this. And, at the time I actually found it a little irritating because I was, such a young go-getter and I often was still busy with whatever I wanted to get done. But I found that that actually ultimately, because he was so adamant about it, it actually created for me that like Friday night is the least stressful period of my entire life, full stop, since I started a career. Because it's the one night I sort of have mental permission to do nothing and to just exhale, and everything can get done either over the weekend before Monday or on Monday. And so, it can be even just setting some boundaries like that, that as a community, your office now all has sacred some period of time, whether it's lunch once a week or it's, a happy hour, or if it's just even the office goes dark at 6 p.m. on Tuesday nights, whatever. I think those kind of things can foster a community setting or a community atmosphere, and sort of express the management's value system that there is life beyond these four walls.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, I think one of the things that's certainly I've struggled with and is sort of finding this balance between wanting to be empathetic towards other people in the firm and wanting to kind of form these connections that you talked about as community on the one hand, but the other side of that balance is that when you are in the position of sort of being the boss, right? The counterbalance is that there is a hesitancy that I often feel about being careful about intruding into the personal lives of employees. I don't know how fair it is for me to go to somebody and say, "Gee, are you struggling?" I mean, there may be very legitimate reasons why they might not want to have that conversation with me, or they might even feel that I'm intruding into their personal space. I like to your point, Margaret, about the boss coming around and saying, "Okay, 5:30 is the end of the workday. Now you go have your personal life." I appreciate that. That's sort of like saying there is this clear demarcation line between work life and the rest of life. And that is important. But I think the trickier things is where those two kind of start to intersect, and where problems that people are having in their personal life, or maybe just caused by their work life, are starting to affect their work. And as a boss, that's a very tricky moment because you might both want to help them and reach out to them, but also, again, there's this sort of sensitivity about like, "Gee, I don't want to take over their personal life. I don't want to be the one like taking over their personal problems. Like that's not for me to do. It's almost intrusive. It's almost impolite for me to like cross that boundary into those issues." So like, what is the right way for somebody who's kind of in that sort of boss or management position to kind of think about how to balance those two kind of countervailing needs?
Yeah, I think that is, I mean, as Rena said, it's really has to be sort of customized to each group of people or each employee even potentially. But another illustration of it, I think, is, in trial work. One thing that was really great and a sustainable model in the DA's office that was not present in the US Attorney's office is that in the DA's office, you would grind and kill yourself to get through a trial. And then everybody just understood you needed a recovery period, whether that was coming to the office but not really working terribly hard for a couple days, whether that was just not showing up for a couple days and taking vacation. There was just a culture that said, we universally understand that you are spent and that you need to get back to center before you try to work again. The US Attorney's Office did not have that. You would finish a trial and it would be like, great, you're behind on all these other cases that we were taking care of while you were busy. Please catch up.
You would be on trial as that would happen.
We've assigned you a new case while you're preparing your closing argument. And so, that was a culture that was, in my opinion, ultimately less sustainable for human beings because, you can do that for years. And obviously, there's a lot to motivate you to stay up with that pace, but it's just going to lead to burnout. It's going to lead to a lower quality of work product at some point, and it's going to lead to turnover. And so maybe if it's even that, you don't need to know why they need space. You can just say, I've seen that you've worked, through the night, 3 nights in a row. I really would like you to take Friday off this week. What can we do to make that happen for you? And then they go to therapy, or they go get drunk, or they go sit on their couch and watch Netflix all day. You don't need to be bothered with those details. You just know that they're doing whatever they need to do to get some space and get back to center.
And I think, asking the question that you're asking is the questions that any boss of a law firm who is, should be asking. And that is really the questions that go to the organizational top-down well-being of employees. And the answer is less important kind of than the question, because the question means that the leadership is thinking about you, the employee, and how we can support you. And you're right, walking up to someone's office and closing the door and saying, it seems to me that you have been very stressed out lately, or, might be incredibly intrusive. However, having that your ethos is that way rubs off on your staff. And so you're creating that environment of kind of more openness, and somebody not being afraid to come to say, hey, I need a break in this way, or hey, I need the support in this way.
Yeah. Well, these are difficult issues of human interaction, and as issues like that often are, they're complicated, and there's no one simple answer to every situation, although we might hope there was. So that kind of leads me to ask this question. Tell me about your current law firm. Well, let me start with this question. Your law firm is called Alka Law. Now, most law firms are just the last names of the partners with an ampersand in between, but your law firm is not Paul and Gandy or Gandy and Paul. You picked almost like a new name for your firm, Alka Law. So tell me, what is the genesis of that name?
So you've been speaking to us for a little while, and you probably have gathered that we're trying to do things differently than most people do them. And the one thing that we did not want to do was name our firm after ourselves. So when we were thinking about a name, we ended up where we are, thinking about the alchemy of the two of us, of the work that we were trying to do being more kind of holistic. And so Alka, the prefix is a take from the word alchemy.
I thought the alchemists were the people that were trying to turn lead into
That's
gold.
also
Is that
true.
your goal?
That is also true.
Yeah, I think you're secretly running like a chemistry lab at the bottom of your
Never
law
know.
firm. Is that what this is all about? So tell me, what is your current practice, and what are the ways that you're kind of using the stuff we've been talking about, this trauma-informed lawyering and lawyer well-being? How does that play into the practice that you're trying to build with your firm?
So I think what Rena and I, in these sort of closed door sessions when we were sort of figuring out what will life after government look like, part of, I think, what we both realized is that we had a career of crisis management and problem solving. And so really that is what our business model is. And the application of that has been, multifold. One is we have taken on work with individuals who have been victims of sex crimes, who maybe don't know what they want to do with this experience, whether they want to pursue a criminal case, a civil case, whether they just need safety planning through family court, like an order of protection. And so we have used our experience to sort of have these trauma-informed conversations and find out, as best we can, the facts of the situation, and then offer guidance about, if you choose to pursue a criminal path, here's what that would look like, here's what that would feel like. Civil, it would feel and look like this. Family court, protections, this and this. And so really trying to offer like a concierge, service to people who are lost in that moment of suffering, and give the benefit of our, expertise in the systems that we've operated in. So that's one arm of it. But really, the skill set that we're talking about is transferable to really any investigative work you do. So we've worked with private K through 12 schools and nonprofit organizations as well, doing investigative work that can support legal advice. So, allegations of misconduct in a school setting, whether it's student on student or staff member on staff member or staff member on student, really the skill set is transferable to all of those. You need to get as much information in the hands of the decision makers as possible. And the best way to yield a fulsome accounting of the information is to use the trauma-informed approach in your interview and investigative strategy. and then provide the decision makers with legal advice about what should be done on the heels of that. And part of the thing that we are really hoping to emphasize and have been emphasizing is the holistic approach. Like there's the triage of the crisis at hand, and that's critical. And that's typically what we're hired for. But if you can get through that crisis and then take a 30,000-foot look, you can sort of find ways to effectuate longer term change. And the hope is to be change makers in a school community, in a corporate environment, in a nonprofit employment setting, so that the suffering that was felt by not only the victim and the accused in this triageable situation, but really the whole community that witnessed it and sort of suffered, at arm's length from it, can hopefully be avoided again. I mean, that's really where the value of the service is. It's not the best business model, maybe, but we really would be thrilled to have that kind of an impact and leave a environment, whether it's a school or corporate setting or a nonprofit, better than we found it.
Fantastic. And are you also doing the sort of training? Is that a sort of a service that the firm offers?
Yeah, that's part of what we're building out is trainings that can effectuate that longer term change and kind of have an impact on the climate in the community setting. We have a partner that we work with who focuses mostly on abuse prevention in schools and camp settings. So she's not in our firm; she has her own business, but she also offers those services, and so we have a collaboration with her if that suits the situation where she can provide her trainings as well. So yeah, we absolutely see trainings and policies and taking the temperature of the community members who are affected by these situations as a way to institute longer term change.
Fantastic. So before we get to the discussion about adult coloring and movement meditation, which I'm looking forward to, let me ask one more kind of substantive question, which is there are a lot of lawyers out there who find the job difficult and stressful and who become unhappy as lawyers and often drop out. I think the dropout rate from the profession is pretty high. What kind of advice would you give to a lawyer who is sort of unhappy in the profession? Would you tell that person just get out, or is there some better way to be a lawyer that might make them happier and more satisfied in the profession?
So I think Maggie and I would both tell you, having gone through this journey, this is less of a question for lawyers, more of a question for, passion and your life's work, that being in something, doing something every day that you don't love is soul crushing. Doing something every day that's making you unhappy or is so stressful that you can't live your life, is really tough to take. And that having a dream and having a vision of what something else, trying to find space to find that is what would be my first recommendation. And being two people who stepped out of a very traditional government role into an entrepreneurial startup role is a big leap that we both took. And it's been, I'm not suggesting that everyone should take this leap if you're a prosecutor, but I'm saying that from that, experience, that quitting something and going to do something completely different can be incredibly invigorating. And so if you're sitting in your job every day unhappy, and many of us have to stay at jobs for many different reasons, so I'm not saying that not everyone has the luxury of doing that today, but to start to think about the things that make you tick. I mean, there's a book by Wes Moore, and you can listen to him on podcasts as well. He has this discussion of what is your work versus what is your job, and that your job is something that you go to every day to get paid money to do so you can live, and your work is the thing that you would do even if you weren't getting paid. So reflecting and meditating and sitting with, what is my work? What is the stuff I'm really good at? What is the stuff that I really like to do, or it seems easy for me that other people aren't as good at, is the beginning of, even if you don't end up getting paid for it, or you're doing it on the side of the work that you're doing for money, of having a more kind of fulfilling professional existence. And that is, by the way, one of the pillars of well-being that we talk about in the training, is thinking about your occupational pursuits and what you're doing with what's the purpose in your life.
Anything you want to add to that, Margaret?
Yeah, just to add, I think it's easy as lawyers coming out of law school, it's easy to sort of see a tracked approach to your career trajectory. And a lot of us fall into that, sometimes intentionally, sometimes absentmindedly, or just by, the sheer force of that's where you're being sort of directed. And so if you find yourself along that path and unhappy, um, using your network of people in your life to find out other applications of a very valuable skill set. I mean, legal training is a valuable skill set. You don't have to be in a courtroom for it to be an asset. You don't even have to be in a law firm. And so finding other ways to mirror or to match that skill set with something that is a passion of yours, whether it's, for me, it was like, as I said, that story of that human experience that was so different than my own that I found so fascinating. And I wanted to understand how life choices end people up in certain places. That curiosity about the human experience is what has guided my whole career and continues to in private practice. And that has nothing to and everything to do with my practice of law.
Well, that's very good advice, and hopefully somebody out there can make use of it. Well, this has been a really, really fascinating conversation about trauma-informed lawyering and lawyer well-being. So I want to thank you both for that, and wish you the best of luck in your practice. But as we normally do on the Garrulous Gavel podcast, I want to just end with something completely different. We try to get a little look into our guests' lives outside of the law, and so Rena, why don't we start with you? Tell me about something interesting you've been doing to kind of deal with the stress of the pandemic.
So I practice a moving meditation practice that is called 5 Rhythms, and it is a really, at its core, I would say it's a dance class, a fun dance class, but it's much more than that as you kind of get deeper into it. But I think, we talked about really at the heart of your last question about, how to transition outside of the law if you want to do something different is the idea of being creative. And I think, creativity in the law is something that isn't, we go to law school, we learn logical reasoning, we learn, inside the box thinking, and finding space to take yourself outside of the box into something that is much more creative allows you to come back to the work in a much different kind of a space of creativity. And so that is one way that I find that in my practice.
So what is 5 Rhythms? Tell us about that.
So 5 Rhythms is a moving meditation practice. It's basically, there is a teacher, and that person plays music, and they guide you through an experience in which you free move effectively. So you are dancing and moving your body kind of in whatever way is feeling appropriate in that day, and being guided by the teacher into different ways of movement. There are books on it if you're interested to read about it. You can read more about it. There are classes all around the world. I mean, it's a worldwide community. It's a lovely community full of really amazing people. So if you're anywhere in the world listening to this, you may have access to it. And it's got a lot of layers of learning as you kind of unfold. But at the bottom, it's a sweaty dance class for 2 hours or an hour, and you listen to good music and dance.
Oh, that actually sounds like fun. I imagine you have to learn to be not particularly inhibited around other people in order to do something like that. I think we all have the experience when we're young of like getting into like a dance club and just kind of dancing. But as you get older, you start to be maybe I shouldn't speak for anybody other than myself. As I've gotten older, I've become a little more self-conscious about letting other people see me dance.
Yeah, and I think, one of the partners in this wellness thing is an amazing teacher of movement. And I think what he would say to you, I think what he would say to you is, that is the invitation for more movement. And that is really at the heart of kind of one of the major things we learn through this practice is confronting all the ways that the things that are going on inside our head as we are doing movement, and then interacting with those things. What does it bring up for you? Okay, well, I'm self-conscious as I'm experiencing this. I don't like the way people are looking at me. I'm gonna, if I'm on video, I'm gonna turn my video off. And none of it is bad. All of that is kind of the invitation to learn more about yourself and what kind of dancing in front of a group of people means to you. But, you can be as inhibited or uninhibited as you want. You can sit on the side and listen to the music for 2 hours if you'd like. Nobody's going to say anything to you. There's no dance moves. There's no, you got to do this. It's pretty inviting of kind of wherever anyone is at.
Well, it sounds fun. I'm going to give it a try. Do you know if there's a class in DC?
Yes, I'm sure there's actually, yes, I think there's a class in DC. A lot of it has been, COVID has unfortunately, dancing in a room together with people, not necessarily a COVID friendly activity, but there's a lot of outdoor classes that are happening and there's virtual classes. So just check it out. 5 Rhythms. All
right. Awesome. And how about you, Margaret? What do you do in all of your spare time? I'm sure you have tons of it. So what do you do for fun?
Well, my new COVID hobby is adult coloring, as you previewed. And I my sister had given me a book, an adult coloring book. I mean, it's really just coloring, but marketed for adults years ago. And I thought, wasn't that cute? And, I should do that sometime, but it really wasn't until COVID and, the upset of remote working and homeschooling and all the things that came with it, that I really picked it up and took to it with a passion and, got like a little kid in, back to school shopping, excited when a new marker set would come out, or, started hiding them in places so that my little kids couldn't ruin the tips on them like they always tend to do. So I just find it incredibly transformative. I mean, I do it usually in the evenings and, listen to music or something while doing it. And you are singularly focused on, this meticulous activity. And yet it opens your mind to wander through, sort of a more open mindset. So I just find it really, really centering and relaxing.
And so is this working from like what we call a coloring book, like just a traditional coloring book? And what makes it adult is that you're an adult now.
I guess that's all it takes. Yeah, I mean, it's a little different than like, it's not going to have like Mickey Mouse in it. Usually they're pretty intricate designs. So that it's, it really requires like meticulousness and, not surprisingly, as an attorney, perhaps I have a bit of a type A personality. So, I'm very careful to stay in the lines and to, rotate my color patterns and make it look as beautiful as possible. But yeah, I mean, it's just a coloring book. It's just geared towards adults because it's, more intricate, I guess. And for marketing, just to make money, really.
Have you considered maybe drawing outside the lines and just sort of pursuing kind of just art in some other form?
Well, it's funny.
Or do you like having the lines? Is that a part of it?
I'm by personality, I like the comfort of the lines for sure. But the follow-on gift from this was a sketch pad with a collection of like various charcoal pencils. So I think I'm getting a subtle hint from people in my inner circle that maybe it's time to start challenging the inside the lines thinking. So I guess starting a new business falls in line with that. So I'm stretching for sure.
Absolutely. Well, that does sound like fun. And if you have any particular drawings that you're particularly proud of, please scan them in and send them to me. I'll be sure to put them up on my firm's Instagram page, which I think is a new thing that our firm is getting into.
Nice.
Highly recommend that. It's a great marketing tool. So, if Alcala, does Alcala have an Instagram page?
An undeveloped Instagram page.
Soon.
Yeah. Well, that wasn't the first thing we tackled when we started our firm. We're 20 years in and we're just tackling that. But it seems to me that the coloring would be a good entree into that. Well, thank you both for being on the podcast today. This was a really interesting discussion. If people want to reach out to you about any of the things that we've talked to today, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
You can go to our website at Alcala, ALCALAW.com. And you can email us at info@alcala.com.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thanks again. This was really fun. I hope it was fun for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, John. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Garrulous Gavel. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. You can always find us at garrulousgavel.com. If you'd like to send feedback or suggest a guest, please contact us at our email address, garrulousgavel@gmail.com, or on Twitter at garrulousgavel. Our cover art was created by artist and illustrator extraordinaire Joan Tico. Our theme music was written and performed by scientist and saxophonist extraordinaire Robert Tico, and our producer is the inimitable K.O. Myers of Particulate Media. See you next episode.